If you had to guess, what would you say is the biggest distraction to your faith right now? It's not the right, it's not the left, it's not culture or even secularization. Scholars agree that the biggest threat to Christian faith right now is distractions. There are so many things clamoring for our attention. From the screens that we hold in our hands to politics to busy schedules, we constantly find ourselves looking at things other than Jesus, and those things distract us from God and His presence. We live in a distracted world, and some people are great with that. Distractions can serve as a temporary relief from pain or suffering, or they might be an escape from some failure in life or relationships or business. But we hardly ever take the time to just sit alone in silence with our hands free and our minds open to what God has to say to us. Justin Whitmore Early writes, "To sit peacefully in silence requires knowing your soul, knowing who you really are, and being fundamentally okay with that and at peace with it. This is exactly why we avoid it. We don't know who we really are, or if we do, we're terrified of ourselves. Silence confronts us with that fact, so we will do anything to avoid it." Blaise Pascal writes, "All of man's problems stem from his inability to sit quietly in a room alone." Solitude is a spiritual discipline, but solitude is not the same thing as loneliness. And when you first practice the spiritual discipline of solitude, it might feel like loneliness. But the spiritual discipline of solitude removes the distractions from our lives that often pull our attention away from the person who we should be fixing our attention on, Christ. There are so many examples of Christ Himself seeking solitude. Before almost every major ministry event in Jesus' life, He withdrew by Himself and spent time alone with His Father. He spent time alone with God in prayer before choosing His 12 disciples. He spent 40 days alone in the wilderness, spending time with God before embarking on His 3-year ministry. He spent solitude with God after the death of John the Baptist just to grieve. And He also spent time alone with God in His greatest moment of distress, right before He was betrayed and crucified. Jesus did not live a distracted life. In the Gospels, we see His intentionality with every word, every interaction, and every conversation. But His ministry is marked by time alone with the Father. If Jesus needed to be silent before God, how much more do we need that time in our lives? There's a passage in Luke 10 that talks about Mary and Martha, and it's a very famous passage that maybe a lot of people know, but it serves as a good reminder for what distractions do in our lives. It's Luke 10, beginning in verse 38. "As Jesus and the disciples were on their way, He came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to Him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what He said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to Him and asked, 'Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work all by myself? Tell her to help me.' 'Martha, Martha,' the Lord answered, 'you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her.'" Now, this passage can be interpreted many different ways, and there's many different lessons in it, but when it comes to distractions and how we live our lives, there are things that will pull our attention away from Jesus. It's just how life is. And those things are not bad things. It was not bad of Martha to do preparations to care for people that were in her home and to show hospitality. It was good for her to do those things. But when those things take precedence over the presence of Jesus, Jesus, who had 3 years on earth, and spent some of that time in the home of Mary and Martha. Martha was so distracted by what she had to do, by the things on her to-do list, by the things that she had to do to make herself feel worthy. She was so distracted by those things that she missed out on the very presence of the living Son of God who was in her home for a short amount of time. And Jesus calls attention to the fact that Mary was not distracted by these things. She found the true treasure, and that was the presence of Jesus in her life. There are things that we're distracted by. Netflix, different shows, TV, the screens in our hands, social media, work, family, relationships. These things are not bad, but they do not have our best interests in mind. These things do not care if our attention is drawn away from the presence of Jesus. It's why it's so important to draw near to God and purposefully come into his presence. So how do we incorporate this spiritual discipline of solitude into our lives? The first thing that we have to do is make room for God. We have to make sure that we are putting things down, removing things from our lives that serve as distractions instead of serving as ushering us into the presence of God. First, we can recognize the small moments of our day that do usher in solitude. In the moments that we find ourselves alone, what do we fill that time with? If you're waiting in line at a coffee shop, are you scrolling on your phone, or are you taking in the people who are made in the image of God that are around you, that are facing their own individual struggles? If you wake up early in the morning, the first thing that you reach for, is it your phone? Are you checking your email wondering who at work needs you, or checking social media wondering how can you improve your self-image? Or are you coming into the throne room that we're invited into the very presence of Jesus, and realizing that you are deeply loved by him? There is nothing on your phone. There is nothing you can read in a book. There is nothing you can watch on a screen. There is no other person on earth that can show you your true value outside of Christ. So these moments where we find ourselves alone, ask yourself, what am I filling that time with? Am I filling it with a distraction, or am I welcoming the presence of God in my life? Remove the things that distract you and ask God to replace those distractions with his presence. Think about his faithfulness. Dwell on his majesty. If you find that even in silence and solitude that your thoughts wander, there is freedom in just confessing to God that despite your desire to be close to him, your human nature gets in the way. He will bless a heart that is humble and willing to seek him. Ask him to help you release whatever is keeping you from knowing and understanding his immense love for you. You do not have to go searching for God. He is waiting for you. He's right there. He wants you to put down the things that are distracting you from him and welcome his presence into your life.